Thanks everyone for taking your seats. We want to start. Somebody just pointed out to me the Kramer and Kramer show. Similar last names for the fireside chat. So while folks are coming in, I'm going to start announcing the fireside chat on the DMA and its implications for the industry. So I'm really looking forward to this because after the morning discussion, this is kind of relevant, right? Like we had a question about, okay, so what can we learn from Europe? And what are the implications of the DMA for the industry? So I'm really excited that we are joined by a very nice set of folks here from different perspectives, right? We have Shelley Kramer. She is the principal analyst and founding partner at Futurum Research. And I'm really excited to see, Shelley as an industry analyst bringing her perspective also as a senior entrepreneur in tech to this panel. With Jack Kramer, who is a professor at Toulouse School of Economics. He's been a professor at other places in the US before, at UPenn and Virginia Tech. And from April 2018 to spring 2019, he was a special advisor to the European Commission for competition for Margaret Vestager. And in that capacity, he co-authored the report on competition policy for the digital era, a lot of which was blueprint for the DMA. So I'm really looking forward to get into this discussion with the two of you. Over to you, Shelley. Thank you.
Absolutely. What a fascinating discussion it is we are following. So I feel like I'm very loud. I feel like my job here is to pull out the brilliance from Jacques, who has been truly an architect of the Digital Markets Act. And our conversation today is going to be centered on the DMA, exploring its implications, and then thinking about, what its implications in the United States and what we can learn. So let's start with the DMA and the rationale for its adoption, if you will. In very general terms, if you would share with us, what were the concerns that the European Union saw in digital markets, and how did it seek to address these concerns with the adoption of the DMA?
So first, I'm afraid I'm not an architect of a DMA. I don't deserve either that praise or that blame, whatever it is. What happened is that, I think it was in spring in 2018, I received a phone call from the Commission asking, would you accept to be a special advisor to Commissioner Vestager to think about the future of competition policy. And the Commission created a team of 3 people, myself, Professor Heike Schweitzer, who teaches the law in Berlin, and Yves Alexandre de Montjoie, that's such a beautiful Belgian name, who teaches computer science at Imperial College. And the 3 of us, we didn't know each other at all before, had to kind of merge and come up with something which made sense about what should competition policy be. And our report, actually, we had a limited amount of time. We're just 1 year. We didn't know each other. There was some retooling to be made. I think I knew how to analyze digital markets. I didn't know very much detail about competition policy. Clearly, Yves Alexandre didn't know any. So we decided not to look at regulation and only to focus on the competition policy. What we tried to point out is something which a number of the speakers of a previous panel spoke about, is the fact that you've got network effects, increasing return to scales, and those industries, the digital industries, are very different from traditional industries, and that dominance can be long-standing, dominance can arise even with a little difference of quality, which is something that Howard pointed out too. And we propose a certain number of reforms to the way in which competition policy was done in Europe. Let me point out 2 of them quickly. First, we said, look, the consumer welfare standard has got one good thing. It focuses the mind on is what the is what the firm is doing good for the users or not? But it's very, very hard to apply. So we shouldn't kind of be, can we exactly measure to the euro what is the loss in consumer welfare? The second thing, which is closer to what we are speaking about, is that we propose that for a certain number of practices, there should be a change in the burden of proof. So for instance, we said, if assume that a firm impedes multi-homing. Now, economists have become very good at making models in which everything can be good or bad. Okay, beginning graduate students after 6 months should be allowed to make you 5 models in which preventing multi-homing is bad and 5 models in which it's good. Okay, but we said no. In general, we would think that preventing multi-homing by a dominant firm is something which is anti-competitive, and hence it should have to have a burden of proof of proving that in the case it's doing it, it's a good thing. Okay. Clearly, what I think happened afterwards, because I wasn't in touch with the commission, is that they looked at this and they looked at the information they had and decided that this was just too complicated. So they decided to go the regulatory route and to take the DMA. I think most of you know what the DMA is, but basically it's a list of rather specific obligations, a little bit like in the American bills. And says you are not allowed to do this, okay? But it only applies it to the very big companies. So in that sense, our report might have some influence on the way the DMA has been built.
That's awesome. So what I wanted to talk about now is that, as we heard in the last panel discussion, we talk about these things here in the US in terms of antitrust. And in the EU, by contrast, there was a general consensus that expanding antitrust law wasn't actually the right tool to use, and adopting instead a regulation that sets clear rules, as you just talked about, for the large digital platforms up front, was considered more effective. So can we talk a little bit more about this? And, is this, part of the question is this assessment correct? I feel like we're probably still in the early stages that we assume it's correct. We don't yet know.
No, so it's correct. Clearly the DMA is not antitrust, okay? It's regulation. On the other hand, lots of obligations in the DMA are coming from antitrust cases that the Commission has been thinking of bringing or has brought and decided, under antitrust law, it's going to take us forever to get through this thing, so why don't we do it through regulation? So, no, it's not antitrust, but it's not as far from antitrust. It's been very much influenced by the antitrust practice of the European Commission.
So do you think that one of the reasons for, the DMA really faced little opposition, it was adopted in a fairly rapid period of time. So I'm guessing that you think that probably was due to taking antitrust out of the equation?
Yes, and I think also, there's probably in Europe less of a fear of overreaching government intervention. And in this case, the government intervention is only for for a small number, we don't know exactly how many, very big firms in rather limited terms. And so I think the general political framework was better than, is more conducive than in the US.
I feel like even coming out of this last panel discussion, I feel like some criticism of our political system here in the United States is that we seem to get in our own, we can't agree regardless, whatever it is, one party wants, the other party absolutely doesn't want simply because they want it. So I think we tend to get in our own way when it comes to making advancements on this kind of thing that perhaps you don't have quite as much, at least as it related to the DMA.
Yeah, but it's not really a good thing. Okay. I taught at Virginia Tech, and I arrived at Virginia Tech 1 year, 2 years, no, 1 year after Jim Buchanan had left to go to George Mason. So I assume that his spirit was still floating through the halls. And I'm somewhat worried that when we discuss regulation, we don't discuss enough the incentives of a politician and of a regulator. And actually, for the previous panel, should have spoken a little bit more about this. You have to be also, I mean, it's true that there are market failures. It's also true that you've got political failures. And in Europe, we are a little bit less worried about the political failures. And I think, a little bit more discussion about what would be the incentives of the regulator when it goes about implementing the Digital Markets Act would have been something which I think would have been welcome. So I don't see any big nasty things. Okay, so I'm not saying it's not an accusation, but it's just kind of a way in which the discourse in Europe goes. I think we should have been a little bit more careful about are we giving too much power,
Yes.
to.
We have some other forces at play, I think, that get in the way.
So in Europe, when we discuss this, it's not so much are we giving too much power to bureaucrats. There's some of this, but there's very much in some countries are we giving too much power to Brussels. And interestingly enough, as far as I know, in the case of DMA, there's been very, very little fear of delegated. I mean, there's been some, but not very much fear of giving too much power to the EU as opposed to the national governments.
Yes. Yeah, that makes sense. So how do you feel about Will's comment that he made a little bit ago about the EU overplaying its hand with the DMA? I was sitting next to you when he said that.
Yeah.
So.
I think he was wrong, okay? I think the DMA overall is well balanced, okay? But it's just a law, okay? And you're going to have a regulator, and right now the EU is thinking about how are they going to, what are going to be the strategies for implementing this law. Right. I think lots is going to come from the way with the implementation is done. I'm somewhat encouraged that there's been huge amount of consultation with, at least with what we call the GAFAMs in Europe, the Google, Amazon, and so on. Even on the, so I just wanted to correct something which I think Bill said, that there is a process in the DMA for discussion with firms about how the obligation should be understood. In the DMA itself, it's true only for part of your obligation. Article 5 has basically obligations which everybody should understand just by reading them, and Article 6 are obligations which require to be explained and explored and made more precise. Okay? Now, nobody really believes that the obligations in Article 5 can be understood just by looking at them, but there's been actually quite a bit of discussion to do this. So I mean, the beginning seems to be promising, okay, but no, we need to see how it's going to go on.
Well, talking about that, let's talk about the practical effects of the DMA and more specifically, share with us some of what you think will be possible, for instance, for app developers or gaming companies or other companies that aren't possible right now.
Well, clearly there are things, which are, have to be made. So, for instance, as far as I understand, okay, but I may be wrong, something like the access to the NFC chip on Apple is going to be feasible, okay, which is something which would have been done years ago, and I still not understand how we are not able to do this through antitrust. Some of the interoperability requirements, I totally agreed with what Howard was saying. It's quite complicated in practice, but are going to be very important. There are some others of which it's going to be interesting to see how much difference they make. So, for instance, European firms have been very upset by the fact that Amazon in particular was using data which it had about what's happening on its platform to develop its own products. So
Yes.
Amazon Essential products, yeah, where, and this is going to be forbidden.
Well, and there's been talk of, Apple doing this for
Yeah.
a long time as well. It's
But
not just Amazon.
how much this is going to happen? I think, on the other hand, there's going to be some important issues. For instance, the opening up of the app stores is going to be very, very important, both in terms of diminishing the rents that, in particular, Apple can get from its app store, but also for innovation in, making, for instance, giving the ability to game companies to make mini app stores which are going to be able to link things better together and so on. So I think there's going to be quite a bit of benefit.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it has to leads to opportunity in terms of audience discovery, and when you're trying to innovate, when you're trying to compete against big players and you're not as big of a player, finding your audience, being able to connect with them easily, being able to accept payments directly, all of those sorts of things. I think these are the kinds of things that will be a big step forward, and I think will spur innovation as well.
We hope so.
We hope so. We hope so. And I think that, I think we'll see, I'm hoping that we'll see the ability to innovate more rapidly and control things more. I already mentioned control relationships, but have access to data that in many instances developers don't have right now. And so data and insights and that sort of thing, I think will.
In particular, I think that the ability for apps to have direct relationship with their consumers rather than being prisoner of, the phone manufacturer is something which is really important.
So my next question is about, we have seen in other industries, for instance, fintech, that imposing specific duties on the incumbents in the industry has actually led to, an unleashing of innovation and has also led to some incredible economic growth. Bill touched on this in the earlier panel when he gave the example of and I'm laughing because it surprises me sometimes how quickly we forget about things. But remember when the phone company owned your phone number, and what a pain it was to think about either, staying held prisoner because you really liked that number and everybody knew it, and wanting to move to a different provider. And I had totally forgotten about that until he gave that example. But I think that it presents an exciting opportunity, and I would love to have your thoughts on that.
Yes, two things about this. First, I don't know very much about financial regulation, but clearly the financial markets are very different from what's happening in the digital economy. Right. I'm sorry, you see me hesitating once in a while because I hate the way that the markets is used to speak about things which are not markets from an economic viewpoint. Okay, so that's why once in a while you see me kind of cringe.
Please, I'm not an economist. Please accept my most sincere apology.
No, I have to use the term, but I don't like using it myself. But in the financial markets, you've got lots of banks, financial institutions. They're all different, but they've got some similarities. So you make regulations on all of them, and the regulation on the financial sector go very, very deep inside the companies. You cannot promote people to some levels without kind of referring to the regulator. It goes very, very deep. Clearly, we are not going to get regulation which is which is as precise in the case of the digital firms because they are very different from each other. So we can't. So I'm a little bit wary about saying, because it worked in the digital, in the financial regulation, it should. The second point. But yes, it provides a good idea, but we shouldn't kind of just say, we can do it in one case, it will work in the other.
So time will tell.
The second point I would like to stress is that, and this is mostly, I say that every time I speak. I think it's very important for European audiences, but too bad you'll have to listen to it too. The European problem in innovation is not due to the fact to big tech. Europe has a problem of innovation. Huge amount of innovations are coming from the US. The US beats Europe in terms of innovation by large margins. And then it comes from, I don't know exactly what, our university system, our tax system, whatever. But just to take an example, Snowflake was a company created by Europeans in the States, just rising up the wall, okay? So I don't think that this will unleash a huge amount of innovation in Europe. There are other problems of innovation in Europe. Okay? Yeah. So maybe it will unleash more innovation in the US, and in this case, you can say thank you.
Well, yeah. I think our problem isn't innovation as much as it is regulation. And you're much better at that than we are in some ways. So speaking of that, okay, the DMA is an EU regulation, and several commentators have emphasized that its practical effects will be felt outside the borders of the European continent. So, we've seen this with GSMA. So what do you think about that? And what do you think about the Brussels aspect?
So this is interesting because I kind of knew I was going to be asked these questions.
Yeah.
So last night, rather than finishing the minibar in the hotel room.
Oh, and you know what? Hold on. I should mention that Jacques came here yesterday for just this amount of time to only be here and share his thinking with us, and he's leaving later today. So we owe you such a huge thank you.
Thank you.
We do. It's awesome.
You should especially thank me for not finishing the minibar. But so I went through the different parts of the DMA and tried to think about which ones would apply, would kind of have a mechanical effect outside of Europe and not. So, for instance, all the interoperability things seems to me are going to have effects outside of Europe, because it's going to be very, very hard for the big companies to maintain a set of API which is open in Europe and not open outside of Europe. So they're kind of very interesting things on that type. But there, for instance, the requirements on the transparency of pricing for advertisers. And I don't think this will apply to the US. But on the other hand, there could be real, pressure on the companies. Hey, you are giving this data to European firms. Why aren't we getting it in the US? So, the effect won't be mechanical. And then there's some very, very strange things which I realized looking at this. Actually, in the coffee break, I'd love to have the opinion of some lawyers on this. So, for instance, the requirement that you cannot use the data of the consumers in order for developing your own products. Okay, but assume that a company uses the data of its American consumers, or Canadian or British consumers, in order to develop a product, and then sells this product, which competes against a European product, okay, in Europe. Is that legal, illegal? I mean, where do we stand on this? What is the international reach of this thing? It's certainly not written in the text. And I have no idea. So there are also going to be interesting things of interpretation about which requirements in the DMA are worldwide and which are just European. And so I think it's an open, it's going to be very diversified depending on the obligations.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting to watch how this plays out for sure. So we have seen reports that, not surprisingly, big tech players aren't happy about this, and that they're gearing up to, of course, fight the European Commission's enforcement of the DMA. So how do you think this will play out?
So first, I think it depends on which big tech you are thinking about. Okay, so for instance, Microsoft, and I should say I've got some conflict of interest here. A, I have a son who works for Microsoft, and B, I manage a program funded by Microsoft at the Toulouse School of Economics. Okay, but Microsoft has publicly said that it welcomed some regulation and wanted to engage constructively with a commission about this, whereas Amazon, for instance, has very heavily criticized the DMA. Just one point on this. Amazon has criticized the DMA, in particular saying that it's aimed at a few big US companies. Okay? But actually the range of a DMA is probably going to be broader than the range of the American bills, who are very much focused on just 5 American companies, whereas the European bill will probably, the DMA will probably catch, it's not clear yet, some of the biggest European players. So it's a little bit strange to accuse the EU to be anti-American when the US Congress is even more anti-American, but we will pass on this. So here I think there's going to be 2 things. A, there's going to be a question of giving as little data as possible to the Commission. And B, there's a question of going in front of the EU court and raising constitutional arguments about whether or not the DMA is disproportionate to what it's kind of infringes on the liberty of commerce in a way which is disproportionate to what it's trying to do. I'm sorry, those are not the technical legal terms, but it's basically what it means. And I don't think it will work, but I'm really not a specialist on this, and I don't.
Yeah, it will be interesting because what we've seen a lot have been regulations and breaking regulations and fines, and one of the things that I think the EU has done particularly well is haven't played around with fines. I mean, in some instances have levied some very, very big attention-getting fines, and it seems like that may be a way. Will made a comment earlier that he didn't really think that was effective because, a fine is worth one day's revenue or something like that. What do you think about that? What do you think?
Well, I mean, A, they don't like paying fines. B, I love it when American companies pay fines to help me with my taxes.
Of course you do.
And then the DMA also has structural measures as a possible punishment, which would be something which would be, which would be important. Now, by the way, you haven't asked me the question, but I think it's an important thing about something which I think is important in the DMA. The DMA requires the firms who've been identified as gatekeepers, that's what we call them in Europe, to produce an annual report on the way in which they are meeting the requirement of the DMA. And furthermore, the DMA doesn't say you have to obey those rules. You say you have to show that you are obeying the rules. Okay, so there's a reversal of the burden of proof. Okay, which I think is going to be very, very interesting to see how this plays out. Okay, we will know a little bit about what's in this report because they're supposed to provide a non-confidential summary of the report. I hope it's not really. I hope it's meaty enough and more than a 2-page summary. But I think this is a really interesting tool, which I think would be, for regulation. Okay, and it's going to be interesting to see how the Commission kind of forces the companies to say, no, we've checked and we are not discriminating against our customers compared to our own product, or we've done A and B testing, and we can show that we are not discriminating. Or we've done A and B testing, and here's the list of all the tests we've done, and here's why it shows that we are not discriminating. So the way, and the act itself is not very clear about the level of precision, but I think that's a really interesting regulatory tool, which I think we're going to find very, I mean, it will be really interesting for all of us to learn from the way this plays out.
So will you provide, or have you provided a template for organizations?
Not that I know of.
So all of these reports that will be submitted as proof will probably be very different.
Okay, I don't know what's happening. I don't know if the Commission is discussing with. I assume there's some discussion about what should be in the report, but I don't know how deep they are. And so on.
So when will we expect those first reports to be filed?
So the first report, I think, it's in the law, but very fast. They have to have a first report, I think, 6 months after they've been designated as the gatekeepers to show, here's what we have.
So somewhat soon.
Yeah.
That'll be very interesting, very interesting. So I would like to know, for those of us sitting here thinking about this and the impacts of the DMA, the spillover impacts globally and here in the United States, what is your best advice for people thinking about, thinking about either operating under a framework like the DMA or thinking about regulations and some of the bills that are in motion here in the United States? What's your best advice on how to think about these things?
So you mean if I were running Amazon?
Yeah, sure.
A good question. Look, so first thing, I think that thinking if you are a very large big tech company, okay, that you're going to escape regulation and public oversight is just crazy, okay? You've got so much influence in the world, okay, that just politically, I mean, that's what Will was saying earlier, okay, just politically, you've got so much power, people are going to check on what you're doing, okay? So going and saying, oh, we're good guys, okay?
Trust us.
To trust us, and the market is going to take care of it. Look, that's not going to work. So don't even try it. Okay. Again, I don't think that the people who work for the big tech companies are bad guys. I can't stand the idea, those people are all mean and nasty and so on. No, I mean, they're just normal people. They try to do their job well and so on. But, when you've got lots of power, you're going to have oversight. Okay, so don't fight the oversight. Okay, and then I would say, look, try to see what you can do to given the regulations. I think on lots of things the regulations are not very onerous. Okay, it's true that on some other aspects they're presumably going to be very difficult to implement. Okay, and when you speak to some of the big tech companies, they tell you, look, it's very, very difficult. We've got to explain to engineers all the way down there somewhere what they can do and can they do when they're developing software. And sometimes they even get too nervous about it. They try to. So I think yes, it's difficult, but I mean. Again, I think most of the regulators are going to be in the long run are going to be somewhat responsible, and I would say, just try to have a normal type of relationship with the people who are doing this. I think that fighting it and saying it's a scandal and so on, I really don't think is very useful. Okay, and,
and I think if it can be approached with the mindset, the true mindset of we want to spur innovation, we want to spur creativity and business success, but we also want to protect consumers and their data and their privacy, and all of these things actually can and should be able to coexist. I think that, it's a little bit of a Pollyanna outlook, but I do think it is possible and it should be possible. So
I also I'm very much a centrist. So I have a tendency of believing this kind of thing. But maybe I'm also naive. So it's you too.
Well, I know there have to be some questions for Jacques. So let's hear them. Anybody? Oh, come on. He's come all this way. He's been up all night. Here we go. We have a question. Do we?
One of the other areas that we use moving forward is regulation and technology very quickly is obviously AI. That's what you have in place there. There's already a set of guidelines and specific prohibition. I was wondering if you could talk to how you see those proposals as they move forward, dovetailing with what you see in the Digital Markets Act, if indeed you could do so.
Sorry, I didn't quite get.
Could we have a mic? Oh, there we go. Sorry, could we?
I'm sorry.
Yeah, hi. Just to cut that short, I'm also looking at what the EU is doing in terms of AI regulation at the moment, which is moving forward, if you like, behind the DMA. It hasn't reached the act stage yet. But obviously there are certain conditions, requirements, privacies, also a number of prohibitions that are in the draft document. And I was wondering if you talk to how you see that having some kind of interplay with the Digital Markets Act, and beyond that, making, if you like, the EU the primary rule giver for technology, because it reaches across such a breadth of the areas we have to address.
Yeah, so very, very preliminary thoughts on this, okay? And I can change my mind with, if I change my mind in the next 9 minutes, I will tell you, but otherwise I might change my mind. Yes, I do worry about the excess of regulations, because huge number of regulations are coming out, and it's kind of hard to and I don't know all of them. Okay, so for instance, there's a huge amount of interest in the exchange of data, what can be done with data in Europe, and so on. And all of those things are perfectly reasonable things to be worried about, but it's hard to make sure that all those regulations all mesh together. So, and when I say I'm worried about it, I'm not saying I think they're doing too much. I just say if I were serious, I would have spent some time looking at the overall corpus of regulations and think about how they fit together. Okay. Now, is Europe going to become the center of regulation in the world? Okay. Again, that doesn't bother me by itself. What would bother me is if this replaced, and that's coming to what I said earlier, hard thinking about what do we do about the European innovation, which is a much harder problem, and a problem which I think we are not speaking enough in Europe. Okay, and in some sense, doing more regulation is important, but it's relatively easy. Okay, I mean, relatively, okay, it's not easy, but thinking about, what are the mechanics by which we encourage an innovative European industry is going to be and by the way, please, whenever you put this on the web, cut off what I just said, because otherwise I'm going to be insulted by lots of people in Europe. Okay, so it's
Any other questions? Here we have a couple. Oh, yay.
yeah.
We just need a mic.
I think I can speak loud enough.
Okay.
Wanted to ask, as I recall, your study did not address intellectual property and specifically did not address patents or trade secrets, which I think play a big role behind the scenes here. The Furman study for the UK did address patents, not trade secrets, as I recall. I was wondering, since you did take a broad regulatory approach, how the decision was made not to address patents?
Oh, look, there's a big difference. The Furman report was written by a bigger group who had a staff of their own. Okay, so we had some help from the teams at the Commission, who were very helpful and so on, but we didn't have really a staff of our own, so we just didn't have time. Okay, there are things, at one point, we had to finish the report, okay, and so I agree with you, all the IP stuff and so on is important, We were discussing yesterday at dinner. In particular, I'm very worried about the role that some standards play in the digital economy because they play the role in some sense of perpetual patents. Okay? If you control a standard, okay, that gives you huge amount of market power, and that doesn't expire. Okay, so I think we could think about the fact that some standards should become public after a while. I mean, I think it's an important question. We just didn't put it because we didn't have time. A bit like thinking we had thought about, are we going to say something about regulation? And I remember exactly, when we said no, we just don't have time to even begin thinking about this.
I know we had another question out
There was another question from the summary.
Maybe.
Sure. My question is this. You sound like you're
Can you move a little bit so that I can see you?
It's the light.
Thank you.
You were very optimistic about the way that regulators would interact with these firms with some of the challenges that they were going to have in standing up compliance regimes. We've seen something similar with GDPR. It's a big lift for some of these firms. But you also talked about, thank you, some of the incentives that are under-examined when it comes to the activity of regulators. So how do you square those two things in the context of a moment where, there's a good deal of popular skepticism around large enterprises and big tech in particular? Wouldn't the incentive for the regulator, be sort of skewed toward being exceedingly hostile toward these companies? I don't know in the European context. I genuinely am curious, because I think in the United States, you're seeing some of the movement come from, in Congress anyway, the realization that you can win political points.
No, it is a problem. And for instance, and by the way, on the case of the GDPR, it's clear that the GDPR has got some flaws. Okay, everybody agrees on that. It's also clear that it's impossible to get the Commission to admit it. And I've seen kind of panel, I won't give names, but with representatives of the Commission and others who say, look, there's a problem with GDPR, or no, everything is fine. So and that's what I was trying to come to when I was speaking about the incentives of regulators. It's very hard for somebody who's put up a regulation then to say, oh, yeah, you need to change it, I made a mistake. And nothing is perfect. In terms of the hostility to big tech, I'll just make 2 points, but it won't be a complete answer. Yes, I'm very worried about the hostility to big tech, and I think, the technology is absolutely wonderful. They've done, those companies are still very innovative and do great things, and we should cherish them. And I think that the posture, you see statements of, can we do something so that the digital world is not creating only problems? You've got to be crazy to say that. I can speak to my daughter who lives in Hong Kong live, every day when I want to, and see her. The telephone companies were not able to do video phones, so no. The second point, which I think I haven't heard very much in the discussion, but which I think is very important, is eventually whichever regulation is put in is going to have to be implemented by the people who work in big tech. Okay? So when we think about the companies, we always have a tendency of thinking, the CEO, and the CEO is really bad. But actually, eventually, the 100,000 or 500,000 people who work for Amazon, 120,000 people or whatever who work for Microsoft and so on, are going to have to be involved in this, because again, we're changing, the regulation are going to affect lots of things. Okay? And I think it's also very important to get those people on board. So I think that realizing that the employees of those companies also have a stake in this, okay, and we should take this into account when we're speaking about and to the companies, and not just thinking that we're speaking to their financial officers and their lawyers. I think is something which is quite important.
Yeah. kind of like with great success also comes great responsibility. And the goal here isn't to, lay the hammer down and regulate you. We have to figure this out together. Again, my centrist views come out, I guess. Do we have any other questions?
We've got 10 seconds.
Look at how good we did, staying on time.
Thank you, Shirley. Thank you both so much for this fireside chat. And thanks for quoting Spider-Man.